The new fence stood like a jagged scar across my peaceful ranch, a stark reminder of Brenda's determination. Sunlight, usually a warm blanket, now glinted off the shiny, new wire, a cruel barrier where open fields once stretched. But as I watched the HOA members stride confidently through the newly established common pathway they'd so boldly claimed across my land, a quiet, almost imperceptible smile spread across my face. They thought they were simply taking a piece of my land, declaring a section of my ranch as a community pathway. They believed they had won, that their decree was final. Yet, I saw an opening, a delicate seam in their grand plans, a loophole in their own meticulously crafted rules. As they triumphantly put up their flimsy fence, carving a path across my property, I was already setting my own trap. A very polite, very legal trap. Every confident step they took on that new path wasn't just them enjoying a shortcut, it was them signing up for a bill they had no idea was coming. A bill for something they had to maintain, something they had to protect, and something they had to pay for, all because they insisted it was theirs. The cost was ticking up, silently, with every single footstep, an invisible ledger accumulating a staggering sum. Their confident smiles, their quick, purposeful strides across my property, were like coins dropping into my pocket. They just didn't hear the clink yet. And the most shocking part? They had no idea they were already in debt, not just to me, but to a system they thought they entirely controlled. The question remained, how long would it take them to realize the true price of their trespass? My name is David Miller, and I moved to this quiet corner of the world seeking just that, quiet. After years of the relentless hustle and bustle of city life, the constant blare of car horns, and the cramped, impersonal feel of apartment living, I craved open space, the scent of fresh earth, and the genuine tranquility that only a vast sky and rolling hills could offer. I found it here, nestled in a community that, on paper, promised idyllic suburban charm combined with generous acreage. My ranch, a sprawling 20 acres that sloped gently towards a winding creek, felt like a dream come true. It wasn't a working ranch in the traditional sense, no cattle or vast crop fields, but rather a sanctuary. Tall, ancient oak trees dotted the landscape, their branches reaching like gnarled arms towards the heavens, providing cool shade and a sense of timelessness. The creek, a meandering ribbon of silver, chuckled softly as it flowed over smooth stones, a constant, soothing lullaby. Wildflowers, in a riot of purples, yellows, and reds, painted the open fields in spring and summer, attracting buzzing bees and fluttering butterflies. My days quickly settled into a rhythm of peaceful contentment. I spent hours simply walking the perimeter, letting my feet sink into the soft grass, feeling the gentle breeze on my face, and listening to the symphony of nature. The chirping of crickets at dusk, the hoot of an owl in the dead of night, the cheerful chorus of birds at dawn, these were the sounds that now filled my world, replacing the jarring cacophony of the city. I felt a deep connection to this land, a profound sense of belonging that I hadn't experienced before. It was more than just property, it was a part of me, a place where I could truly breathe and simply be. I often thought about the value of empathy, how a little understanding could smooth over so many rough edges in life. I tried to live by that principle, always ready with a smile, a friendly wave, or a helping hand for my neighbors. I believed in the power of small acts of kindness, how they could ripple outwards and create a more harmonious community. This belief, however, would soon be tested in ways I could never have imagined. My first encounter with the formal structure of the community, the Homeowners Association, HOA, was at a welcoming meeting a few weeks after I settled in. I walked into the community center, a pleasant building with a slightly too perfect lawn, expecting a casual gathering, perhaps a potluck, and an opportunity to meet more of my new neighbors. Instead, I found myself in a rather sterile room, arranged with rows of chairs facing a long table where several individuals sat, looking stern and official. At the center of this table sat Brenda, the HOA president. Her posture was ramrod straight, her expression unyielding, and her voice, when she spoke, carried an undeniable air of authority, tinged with a slight condescension. She wasn't just speaking, she was delivering pronouncements. Brenda, a woman with a meticulously coiffed blonde bob and a sharp, discerning gaze, quickly established herself as the unyielding guardian of the community's rules and regulations. Her opening remarks were a lengthy monologue about maintaining property values, preserving community harmony, and ensuring adherence to established covenants. Every other sentence seemed to contain a reference to a specific section or subsection of the HOA bylaws, which she occasionally tapped with a perfectly manicured finger. I learned about approved paint colors for mailboxes, only 3 shades of off-white, the precise permissible height for lawns, no more than 3 inches, measured with a ruler, I assumed, and the strict guidelines regarding outdoor decorations, no excessively whimsical garden gnomes, apparently. It felt less like a welcoming event and more like an orientation for a very strict boarding school. I tried to introduce myself warmly after the official presentation, extending my hand with a friendly smile, expressing my excitement about joining the community. Brenda, however, merely offered a curt nod, her eyes scanning my casual attire with a subtle disapproval before quickly turning to address a question about fence heights from another resident. Her focus was clearly on the rigid structure of the rules, not the human element of connection. It was clear then that empathy was not high on her list of priorities, nor was a sense of neighborly warmth. I left the meeting feeling a little deflated but still optimistic. I thought, perhaps, her sternness was just a facade, a professional front for managing such a large community. I still believed that with a bit of kindness and genuine effort, I could find common ground. My optimism, however, was slowly chipped away over the following weeks. The HOA, or more specifically, Brenda, seemed to have an uncanny ability to notice even the most minuscule deviations from their extensive rulebook. My mailbox, a charming, rustic wooden one that came with the ranch, apparently didn't conform to the approved materials and design guidelines. A polite but firm notice arrived in my actual mailbox, stating that I had 30 days to replace it or face a daily fine. Then came the lawn height notices. Despite my best efforts to keep the grass trimmed, the sheer size of my property meant that by the time I finished one section, another seemed to have grown a quarter-inch too tall in the humid climate. Each notice arrived with a photo, a ruler placed against a blade of grass, and a detailed citation of the relevant bylaw. It felt absurd, like being monitored by a secret lawn police force. Even my beloved bird feeder, a simple wooden structure that brought cardinals and blue jays to my porch, was deemed not within approved wildlife structures, and was cited for attracting undesirable avian species, whatever that meant. I sighed, complied, and adjusted. It was frustrating, certainly, but I kept my cool. I didn't want to start a war. I figured that living in an HOA meant some level of compliance, even if it seemed nitpicky. My focus remained on enjoying my ranch and being a good neighbor. I continued to offer small gestures of kindness. I helped Mrs. Henderson down the street carry her groceries when I saw her struggling. I gave young Billy Peterson, who lived next door, some pointers on his baseball swing when he was practicing in his yard. I shared fresh vegetables from my small garden with anyone who wanted them. I believed that these acts of genuine warmth and community spirit were more important than adhering to every single-minute regulation. My philosophy was that a good neighborhood was built on mutual respect and helpfulness, not on strict adherence to arbitrary rules about lawn height. This contrast between my approach and the HOA's rigid control became increasingly apparent. While I was offering tomatoes, they were sending violation letters for tomato plant height. The most persistent, and eventually infuriating, issue revolved around an old, unpaved path that cut across a corner of my property. It wasn't a formal road, just a faint dirt trail worn smooth by decades of occasional use. It had been there long before I bought the ranch, a shortcut used by a few longtime residents to reach the local park or a convenience store down the road a bit faster. When I first saw it, the real estate agent had mentioned it, almost as an afterthought, as a charming quirk of the property, a historical pathway. I didn't mind. I saw it as a quaint feature, a testament to the community's history, and a gesture of neighborly goodwill. It caused no harm, generated no noise, and was used sparingly enough that it never disturbed my peace. I even thought it was a small way for me to contribute to the community, allowing a convenient passage. Then, Brenda set her sights on the shortcut. At a heated HOA meeting, she declared this unapproved thoroughfare a significant liability, citing potential injury risks and uncontrolled access. She wanted to either shut it down completely or, even more alarmingly, formalize it. Her proposal was to declare it an official, common pathway, gravel it, and integrate it fully into the community's shared spaces. She presented an old, faded map, which she claimed proved that the path had always been common property, a historical right-of-way. I knew this wasn't true. My property deed and official surveys clearly showed that land was unequivocally mine. The map she brandished was a poorly drawn sketch from an original developer's promotional pamphlet, not a legal document. I tried to be reasonable, calmly explaining the inaccuracies of her map and proposing alternatives. I understand the concern about safety, Brenda, I began, my voice steady, but perhaps we could consider rerouting the path. My property slopes nicely, and we could easily establish a new, safer path around my land, keeping it entirely within community property. Or, we could simply formalize an easement, making it clear it's still private land with limited access, ensuring everyone's liability is understood. I even suggested contributing financially to the rerouting, demonstrating my willingness to find a compromise that benefited everyone. But Brenda, with her usual unyielding resolve, dismissed my suggestions out of hand. Mr. Miller, she stated, her voice dripping with an air of absolute finality, the path exists. The bylaws, however obscurely worded, grant the HOA the right to establish and maintain common areas. This path, by historical use, has become one. We will be formalizing it. Her words hung in the air, cold and definitive. It was clear she wasn't interested in negotiation or empathy, she was interested in asserting control. She saw an opportunity to expand the HOA's dominion, to cement their authority over every inch of the community, even parts that were undeniably private property. The kindness I had extended, the patience I had shown with the petty notices, all seemed to vanish into the vacuum of her determination. The tension in the room was palpable. Other residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking apologetically at me, others simply avoiding eye contact, afraid to cross Brenda. The meeting felt less like a discussion and more like a public execution of my property rights. Then, with a flourish, Brenda stood up, her gaze sweeping across the room, landing momentarily on me with a look of triumph. Therefore, she announced, her voice ringing with an authority that seemed to transcend the simple setting of the community center, the HOA board has, after careful consideration and review of all historical documentation, she waved vaguely at the dubious map, voted to officially designate the existing path across Parcel 12, known as the Miller Ranch, as a common pathway for the benefit of all community residents. A low murmur went through the room. I felt a surge of disbelief, then a cold anger begin to simmer within me. This wasn't just about a shortcut, it was about blatant disregard for property rights, about overreach, and about a complete lack of respect for me as a homeowner and a neighbor. Brenda wasn't finished. To ensure safety and delineate the new common area, she continued, her voice gaining an almost celebratory tone, the HOA will be installing a fence along both sides of this new pathway, clearly marking its boundaries. Installation will begin next Monday. My jaw tightened. A fence. On my property. Without my permission. It was a clear, undeniable act of encroachment, a declaration of war on the very peace I had sought. As the meeting concluded, and people slowly dispersed, I felt a deep sense of betrayal. The very next day, a truck rumbled down my driveway, pulling a trailer laden with shiny new fence posts. They were stacked neatly, ominously, at the edge of the disputed path, waiting to carve a division through the heart of my ranch. The reality of Brenda's bold move, her complete lack of regard for personal boundaries and property lines, hit me with a chilling force. This was no longer just about petty rules, this was a direct assault on my sanctuary. The fence posts stood there, stark and imposing, a silent promise of the battle to come. The following Monday dawned with a false sense of peace. The morning light, usually soft and inviting on my ranch, now seemed to highlight the cruel lines of the fence posts that had arrived the day before, starkly awaiting their destiny. Soon enough, the quiet was shattered. A crew, hired by the HOA, arrived with trucks full of rolls of chain-link fence, buzzing saws, and an air of grim determination. I watched from my porch, a lump forming in my throat, as they began their work. The whine of the machinery sliced through the tranquil air, a jarring contrast to the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. First, they stretched the wire, pulling it taut between the posts, creating a shimmering, metallic wall that glinted in the sunlight. Each section they attached felt like a fresh wound inflicted upon my property, a physical manifestation of Brenda's relentless will. It wasn't just a fence. It was a division, a scar across the land I loved, and a blatant disregard for everything I believed about respect and kindness. The crew worked quickly, efficiently, as if they were just doing a job, unaware of the deep offense they were committing. Brenda herself appeared later in the day, standing on the newly defined path, her hands on her hips, observing the progress with a look of satisfied pride. She even offered the workers bottled water, a gesture of generosity that felt deeply ironic given the circumstances. She looked like a general overseeing a successful conquest. I avoided eye contact, retreating further into the solitude of my home, my heart heavy. By the end of the day, the fence was complete, standing like a monument to bureaucratic power, cutting off a corner of my 20 acres, forcing the old, meandering path into a rigid, narrow corridor. My beautiful, open ranch now had a fenced-off path, a public thoroughfare slicing through what was once solely mine. It felt like a part of my soul had been neatly sectioned off and declared communal property. The world felt smaller, more regulated, less free. Yet, beneath the anger and disappointment, a quiet resolve began to harden within me. They wanted to play by the rules? Fine. We would play by all the rules, especially the ones they had forgotten, or perhaps, never even knew. In the days that followed, the fenced-off pathway saw its first trickle of traffic. At first, it was just a few curious neighbors, mostly teenagers on bikes heading to the park, or adults taking a slightly longer route to the convenience store just to see the new addition. They walked with a tentative curiosity, perhaps sensing the strange tension that now hung over my property. I observed them from afar, noticing how they stuck strictly to the newly defined corridor, their footsteps echoing a hollow sound on the freshly laid gravel. Brenda, of course, was one of the first to use it, strolling down the path with a triumphant smile, as if she were inspecting her personal kingdom. She paused briefly at the midpoint, casting a satisfied glance back at the fence, her posture radiating an undeniable sense of ownership over what was, unequivocally, my land. Her actions, far from being just about a path, felt like a deliberate challenge. I saw her as someone who cared more about wielding power than fostering genuine community spirit. Despite this daily reminder of the HOA's intrusion, I continued to find solace in the other 19 acres of my ranch. I spent hours tending to my small vegetable garden, coaxing plump tomatoes and crisp lettuce from the rich soil. The act of nurturing life, watching seedlings sprout and grow, was a soothing balm to my frustration. I also resumed my morning walks, exploring the parts of my property untouched by the fence, finding new appreciation for the hidden nooks and crannies, the gentle slopes, and the vibrant wildlife that thrived there. One afternoon, while trimming some overgrown bushes near my property line, far from the new path, mind you, I noticed my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, struggling to pull a heavy sack of mulch from the back of her car. She was a kind, elderly woman, always quick with a smile and a friendly word. Without a second thought, I walked over. "Need a hand there, Mrs. Rodriguez?" I asked, offering a warm smile. Her face brightened with relief. "Oh, David, that would be wonderful. This old back isn't what it used to be." I easily hoisted the sack and carried it to her garden shed, then returned for another, and another, until all 6 were neatly stacked. "You're a lifesaver, dear," she said, patting my arm gratefully. "Some people around here could learn a thing or two from your kindness." Her words, simple as they were, resonated deeply, reminding me that not everyone was like Brenda, and that true community was built on such small acts of helpfulness, not on rigid rules and forced pathways. It also strengthened my resolve. My plan wasn't about being mean or spiteful. It was about teaching a lesson about respect, about the consequences of trampling over others' rights, and about the true cost of their own overreach. The payment plan I had devised was simple, yet brilliantly effective, leveraging the HOA's own obsession with rules against them. A week after the fence went up, I started my preparations. I spent a few days researching local ordinances and, more importantly, digging deep into the HOA's own labyrinthine bylaws. Buried within a dusty old addendum, dated from before this development was fully completed, I found it, a little-known clause regarding common property improvements and maintenance. It stated that any newly established, common area, that required specific environmental or structural remediation due to its nature, or specific upkeep beyond general landscaping, would incur an annual maintenance fee levied directly upon the HOA, payable to the property owner whose land bordered or contained said common area, provided the owner could demonstrate a prior, existing burden or environmental concern addressed by the improvement. It was designed for things like retaining walls built on common land that supported a homeowner's yard, or drainage systems that ran through shared spaces but prevented flooding on private property. It was an incredibly obscure clause, rarely if ever used. But what if the improvement itself, the newly graveled path, actually created a new environmental or structural remediation need? What if the upkeep beyond general landscaping was something that the HOA's own actions made necessary, and it directly burdened my property? My ranch, as I mentioned, had a small, winding creek. This creek was a vital part of the local ecosystem, home to small fish, salamanders, and a variety of aquatic insects. Its banks were naturally protected by dense, native grasses and carefully placed river stones that prevented erosion, especially during heavy rains. The old, faint dirt path that Brenda had now formalized into a graveled thoroughfare ran perilously close to a particularly sensitive bend in this creek. Before the gravel, the infrequent foot traffic had caused minimal disturbance. But gravel, loose and easily displaced, was a different story. I consulted with an environmental specialist, a kind woman named Dr. Evelyn Reed from a local university. She patiently listened to my explanation, then visited the site, taking samples and measurements. Her findings confirmed my suspicions. The constant foot traffic on the newly graveled path, especially after rains, was causing gravel and sediment to wash down into the creek. This wasn't just a minor annoyance, it was a serious environmental issue. The sediment was smothering native plant life, disrupting the delicate ecosystem of the creek bed, and could potentially harm the fish and other aquatic creatures. Furthermore, the loosened gravel was beginning to undermine the bank itself, threatening to cause erosion and compromise the natural stability of the creek. Dr. Reed's report detailed the need for a specific type of erosion control barrier along that section of the path, a permeable, natural material that would allow water to drain but prevent sediment and gravel from entering the creek. This wasn't just general landscaping. This was specific environmental remediation caused directly by the HOA's improvement. And, critically, the report stated that without this remediation, the degradation of the creek bank would continue, potentially affecting my property's natural drainage and stability downstream. Armed with Dr. Reed's detailed report and my carefully highlighted section of the HOA bylaws, I calmly drafted a formal letter to the HOA board. It wasn't angry or accusatory. It was simply professional, citing the environmental findings and the specific bylaw clause. I stated that due to the HOA's decision to formalize and gravel the path across my property, and the resulting documented environmental burden on my creek, the HOA was now responsible for the immediate implementation and ongoing maintenance of the specified erosion control measures. I attached Dr. Reed's report and a detailed estimate for the necessary work, along with the relevant section of the bylaws. I delivered it via certified mail, ensuring Brenda would have to sign for it. I received no immediate response, which wasn't surprising. Brenda preferred to operate from a position of unchallenged authority. But the silence was short-lived. A few weeks passed, and the weather turned. We had a particularly heavy series of thunderstorms. The newly laid gravel path, without any proper erosion control, became a small river of stones and mud, all flowing directly into my pristine creek. After the storms, the creek bed was visibly choked with gravel and sediment in several spots, a stark and disheartening sight. The damage was now clearly visible, a testament to the HOA's short-sightedness and my own foresight. I documented everything with detailed photographs and dated records. The environmental damage was undeniable, but the bigger issue, to Brenda, was the cost. Then came the next extreme event, an escalation that solidified my plan. The HOA sent me a scathing letter. Not about the creek, not about my proposal, but about my responsibility to keep the new, common pathway, clean. Brenda's letter accused me of neglecting the pathway, citing the gravel and mud washed into my creek as a mess that was detracting from the aesthetic appeal of the common area, and was my responsibility to clean up. She demanded that I hire a crew to remove the gravel from the creek and maintain the path's cleanliness, threatening fines if I failed to comply. It was an outrageous demand, completely turning the situation on its head. She wasn't just dismissing my claim. She was trying to shift the burden of their own destructive actions onto me. It was clear she was doubling down, unwilling to admit any fault. This, however, was precisely what I had anticipated. Her insistence that I was responsible for cleaning up the mess they created, on a path they declared common, was the final piece of the puzzle. It was a perfect, extreme example of their overreach, and it played directly into my hands, cementing the exact reason why they now needed to pay for every step taken on that path. Brenda's outrageous letter, demanding I clean up the very mess they created, ignited a fire within me, solidifying my resolve. Her words were a final, unmistakable declaration that they would stop at nothing to assert their dominance, even if it meant twisting reality and trampling on my rights. But her overreach was also a gift, fitting perfectly into the trap I had so carefully set. That very afternoon, I sat down at my desk, not with a sense of defeat, but with a quiet, steely determination. I drafted my response to the HOA, a document that would shift the weight of their own actions back onto their shoulders. It was polite, almost deferential in tone, but beneath the surface lay a meticulously constructed legal argument. I thanked Brenda for her concern about the aesthetic appeal of the common area and acknowledged the mess in the creek. However, I calmly explained that, as per HOA bylaw section 4.c.2, the obscure clause I had unearthed. The responsibility for specific environmental or structural remediation on newly established common areas fell squarely on the HOA, particularly when the need for such remediation arose directly from the HOA's own improvements. I attached new, time-stamped photographs of the gravel-choked creek after the recent storms, undeniable proof of the damage. I also included the updated estimate for the specialized creek cleanup and erosion control barriers from Dr. Evelyn Reed, the environmental specialist. This wasn't just about scooping out some gravel. It was about protecting a delicate ecosystem, a task requiring specialized equipment and knowledge, and therefore, significant cost. I ended the letter by politely informing the HOA that, since they had declared the pathway a common area and their actions had directly caused the damage, I expected them to arrange and pay for the necessary remediation and maintenance, as stipulated in their own bylaws. I also stated that, should they fail to act within 30 days, would proceed with the necessary work myself and then bill the HOA, adding a small, legally permissible administrative fee for my time and effort in coordinating the common area cleanup. I sent this letter via certified mail, just as I had the first, ensuring Brenda would have no choice but to confront it head-on. The following weeks were a strange blend of quiet anticipation and subtle escalation. The HOA's response to my letter was a heavy silence. No phone calls, no emails, no further letters. It was as if they hoped if they ignored it long enough, it would simply disappear. But the physical evidence of their neglect did not disappear. With every rainfall, more gravel washed into the creek, and the erosion along the path's edge became more pronounced. I continued to meticulously document everything: new photos, notes on rainfall, and observations of the creek's worsening condition. The path, once a mere annoyance, was now becoming a tangible problem, not just for me, but for the local environment. Yet, life on the rest of my ranch continued in its peaceful rhythm. I found solace in my routines, waking with the sun, enjoying coffee on my porch as the mist rose from the fields, and spending afternoons tending to my fruit trees. I also kept up my small acts of neighborly kindness. One sunny afternoon, while I was fixing a broken fence post near the back of my property, I noticed young Liam, who lived a few houses down, struggling with a flat tire on his bicycle. He was about 9 years old, and looked quite frustrated. He didn't even notice me at first, his brow furrowed in concentration. I walked over, my tool belt jingling softly. "Looks like you've got a bit of a challenge there, champ," I said gently. Liam looked up, startled, then smiled shyly. "Yeah, Mr. Miller. I don't know how to fix it." I knelt down, examined the tire, and within minutes had located the puncture. "Tell you what," I offered, "I've got a patch kit. Why don't we fix it together? You can learn how for next time." His eyes lit up. Together, we worked, me guiding his small hands through the process of roughing the rubber, applying the glue, and pressing the patch firmly into place. He watched, fascinated, as the patch bonded, making the tire whole again. "Wow, Mr. Miller, you're amazing!" he exclaimed, his face beaming. "My dad always says you're the kindest person in the neighborhood." His innocent words, spoken with such genuine admiration, were a stark contrast to the cold, calculating actions of the HOA. It reminded me that there were good people in the community, and my fight was not against them, but against a system that prioritized control over common sense and neighborly consideration. It made me feel even more certain that what I was doing, while strategic, was fundamentally about fairness and holding people accountable for their actions, even when those actions were dressed up as community improvements. The 30-day deadline I had given the HOA came and went without a single word from Brenda or any other board member. It was clear they intended to ignore my claim, hoping I would simply give up or perhaps even perform the cleanup myself, inadvertently admitting it was my responsibility. This, of course, played directly into my carefully laid plan. The following morning, I hired a specialized environmental remediation company. They arrived with their equipment. A small, quiet dredge designed for delicate creek beds, specialized nets to catch floating debris, and bags of the permeable erosion control material Dr. Reed had recommended. Their work was precise, careful, and focused on restoring the creek without further disturbance. They worked for 3 full days, meticulously removing the accumulated gravel, clearing the sediment, and then installing the erosion barriers along the section of the pathway that bordered the creek. The difference was immediate and dramatic. The creek ran clear again, its bed visible and vibrant. The path, too, was now stabilized, the permeable barriers preventing any future gravel runoff. When the work was complete, I received a detailed invoice from the company. It was for a substantial sum, reflecting the specialized nature of the work. I added a small, legally permissible administrative fee for my time and effort in coordinating the project, as I had stated in my letter. Then, I prepared a new invoice, addressed directly to the HOA, for the full amount. This invoice was even more detailed than the last, specifying the services rendered, referencing the date of my prior warning letter, citing Brenda's own letter demanding my cleanup, and, most importantly, highlighting the exact HOA bylaw that made them financially responsible for this common area improvement. I sent it via certified mail, once again ensuring a signature upon delivery. This was not a request. It was a demand for payment. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. I walked into the community center, feeling calmer than I had in weeks. Brenda, her usual rigid self, sat at the head of the table, her blonde bob perfectly in place. She looked tired, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The other board members seemed equally uneasy. It was clear they had received my latest invoice. The meeting began with the usual reports on community finances and minor grievances. Then, Brenda cleared her throat, her voice a little strained. "And now," she announced, "we have an important matter regarding the common pathway near Mr. Miller's property." She gestured vaguely in my direction, avoiding direct eye contact. She then attempted to downplay the situation, referring to it as a misunderstanding regarding maintenance responsibilities. She casually mentioned the invoice I had sent, trying to frame it as an unreasonable demand on my part. "Mr. Miller," she began, turning to me with a forced, tight-lipped smile, "we've received your, rather substantial bill for the creek cleanup. While we appreciate your initiative in maintaining the common area." Her voice trailed off, betraying her discomfort. This was my moment. I interrupted her politely, but firmly. "Actually, Brenda," I stated, my voice steady and clear, "the bill is not for my initiative in maintaining the common area. It is for the necessary environmental remediation and structural stabilization of the creek bank, directly caused by the HOA's decision to formalize and gravel that pathway, and the subsequent neglect of their responsibilities as outlined in HOA bylaw section 4.c.2. I paused, letting the specific bylaw section hang in the air. "As you know," I continued, "I informed the board of the environmental damage and your responsibility weeks ago, providing detailed reports and estimates. You chose to ignore it. You then issued a demand that I clean up the mess you created, on a path you declared common property. Per my previous letter, since the HOA failed to act, I proceeded with the necessary work. The invoice you received reflects the cost of that legally mandated remediation." A hush fell over the room. The other board members shifted, some exchanging worried glances. Brenda's face, usually so composed, began to flush a deep crimson. She looked trapped, her authority crumbling in the face of her own rules. The murmurs from the audience grew louder. Neighbors, who had previously been too intimidated to speak up, were now clearly intrigued. This was no longer just about a fence, it was about the HOA's accountability, and the chickens were coming home to roost. The weight of their own decisions, and the money they would now have to pay, was settling heavily on them, and the visible discomfort on Brenda's face was merely the beginning of their realization. This was just the first wave, but the bill was real, and it was substantial. Brenda's face, now a furious shade of red, showed the raw shock of being cornered. My calm explanation, backed by her own bylaws and undeniable evidence, had stripped away her usual air of unshakable authority. She stammered, searching for words, but found only sputtering indignity. "Mr. Miller, this is preposterous. You cannot simply conduct work on a common area and then expect the HOA to reimburse you. This is an unauthorized expenditure." Her voice was shrill, cutting through the murmurs in the room. Other board members, however, no longer looked merely uneasy, they looked genuinely panicked. They knew, as I did, that a formal bill, backed by an ignored warning and the HOA's own rules, was a serious matter. It wasn't just a squabble anymore, it was a financial liability, and a substantial one at that. I remained calm, my voice steady, even as Brenda's anger flared. "Brenda," I responded, keeping my tone even, "the work was necessary to prevent further environmental damage to the creek, which, as you know, is a protected natural feature. More importantly, the need for this work arose directly from the HOA's decision to gravel the pathway, and your subsequent failure to address the issue after being formally notified. And, as I've repeatedly pointed out, HOA Bylaw Section 4.c.2 explicitly covers this exact scenario. It states that the HOA is responsible for specific environmental remediation on newly established common areas that result from HOA improvements. You created the common area, you installed the gravel, you were warned about the consequences, and you failed to act. The work was authorized by your own bylaws, and the invoice stands. I paused, letting my words sink in. Furthermore, I added, your letter demanding I clean up your mess, on a path you declared common, only solidifies the HOA's responsibility. You claimed ownership, and with ownership comes responsibility, including financial responsibility for damages caused. A few more nervous whispers broke out in the room. Some residents started flipping through their own copies of the bylaws, trying to find the obscure section I referenced. Brenda slammed her hand on the table, a loud thud that made everyone jump. "This is an outrage," she practically shrieked. "We will not be extorted, Mr. Miller. The HOA will not pay this fraudulent bill." Her eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, now held a glint of desperation. She was losing control, a rare sight for the notoriously composed HOA president. "We will discuss this with our legal counsel," she declared, puffing out her chest, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "We will not be strong-armed." I simply nodded. "That is your right, Brenda. And I look forward to hearing from your legal counsel. I have all the documentation, including the certified letters, photographs, and Dr. Reed's professional environmental report. I am confident in my position." The meeting ended in chaos, with Brenda quickly adjourning it before any further discussion could take place. As residents filed out, many gave me sympathetic glances, some even offered quiet words of encouragement. "Good for you, David," one man whispered, giving me a thumbs up. "Someone needs to stand up to her." The legal threat from Brenda didn't faze me. I knew my ground, and my actions were rooted in fairness and the HOA's own rules. Weeks turned into a quiet standoff. There was no official communication from any HOA lawyer, only continued silence. It was a sign that Brenda was perhaps bluffing, or that her own counsel had advised her that my claim was indeed legitimate. During this time, the common pathway continued to see daily use. More and more residents, now accustomed to the fence, used the shortcut. Children rode their scooters, joggers pounded along its length, and dog walkers ambled by. Each passing footfall, each turn of a wheel, felt like another silent tick on the growing ledger of the HOA's debt. My payment system wasn't just about the initial cleanup, it was about the ongoing consequence of their choice. Despite the ongoing tension with the HOA, I still made an effort to contribute positively to the community in other ways. My ranch remained a sanctuary, and I often found myself thinking about how a little kindness could prevent so much conflict. One sunny afternoon, while I was out tending to my blueberry bushes, I noticed a group of teenagers struggling to set up a new community garden plot down the street. It was a new initiative, something the HOA had reluctantly approved after much lobbying from younger families, but they hadn't provided much support. The kids looked frustrated, trying to dig hard soil with flimsy tools. I walked over, carrying my own sturdy shovel and a bag of nutrient-rich compost. "Looks like you're having a bit of a battle with the earth there," I said with a smile. "Need an experienced hand?" Their faces lit up. "Mr. Miller." "Yeah, we're trying to get this plot ready for planting, but the ground is really tough." I spent the next hour helping them, showing them how to break up the compacted soil, mixing in the compost to enrich it, and even giving them some tips on what vegetables would grow best in our climate. The teenagers, initially hesitant, soon warmed up, asking questions and laughing as we worked. We talked about how much fun it was to grow your own food, and the satisfaction of seeing something you planted flourish. By the time we were done, the plot looked ready for planting, and the kids were buzzing with excitement. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," exclaimed a girl named Chloe, her hands smudged with dirt. "This would have taken us days." "You're awesome." This interaction was a stark contrast to my dealings with Brenda. It showed that genuine community spirit didn't need strict rules or forced pathways. It grew from shared effort, mutual help, and a simple, genuine desire to make things better for everyone. It reinforced my belief that my current battle with the HOA was not about being punitive, but about asserting a fundamental principle of fairness and accountability. A few months passed, and the silence from the HOA regarding the bill was deafening. No legal letters arrived, no attempts at negotiation. Brenda avoided me like the plague at community events, her eyes darting away if our paths even remotely threatened to cross. The constant foot traffic on the common pathway, however, was having another unforeseen effect. The gravel, which had been put down somewhat cheaply, began to wear unevenly, creating dips and hollows. During dry spells, dust clouds billowed with every step, settling on my property. During rains, puddles formed in the low spots, turning parts of the path into muddy traps. And as more people used the path, the problem grew worse. The HOA, despite having declared it a common pathway, had made no move to maintain it beyond the initial, shoddy graveling. It was rapidly becoming an eyesore and, ironically, a genuine safety hazard. Then came the next extreme event, one that once again played directly into my hands, cementing the HOA's self-inflicted financial burden. A concerned resident, Mrs. Davison, a sweet older lady who often used the path for her morning walks, tripped on one of the uneven sections, twisting her ankle badly. It wasn't a severe break, but it was enough to require medical attention and some weeks of recovery. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. Mrs. Davison's son, a diligent man named Robert, contacted the HOA, demanding they address the hazardous conditions of the path. Brenda, ever eager to deflect blame, tried to tell Robert that the path was still technically on my property and therefore my responsibility. Robert, however, was not easily swayed. He had heard the whispers about the HOA declaring the path common property, and he had seen the fences they installed. He also had a copy of the HOA bylaws, and, armed with a lawyer friend, he found the specific section I had been using. He fired off a sharp legal letter to the HOA, threatening a lawsuit for negligence due to the unsafe conditions of their declared common pathway. He cited the HOA's own declaration of the path as common property and their failure to maintain it, directly leading to his mother's injury. This was no longer just me versus Brenda. This was a direct, very public challenge to the HOA's authority, and it came with a real, tangible threat of a large, expensive lawsuit. The stakes had suddenly, and dramatically, escalated. The HOA, now facing a potential financial disaster far larger than my initial bill, had no choice but to finally acknowledge the consequences of their overreach. The threat of a lawsuit from Robert, Mrs. Davison's son, hit the HOA like a lightning bolt. It was a far more public and potentially ruinous problem than my quiet, legally sound invoice. Brenda, who had managed to brush off my claims, now faced the very real prospect of a costly court battle and a damaged reputation for the HOA. The once silent board members were now a flurry of panicked activity. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and this time, the tension wasn't just palpable. It was a storm brewing. I attended, of course, taking my usual seat, observing the unfolding drama. Brenda, her face pale and her usual composure completely shattered, stood before the room. Her voice, usually so commanding, now trembled slightly as she addressed the assembled residents. "As you know," she began, clearing her throat nervously, "Mrs. Davison unfortunately had an accident on the common pathway. Her son has, engaged legal counsel." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Lawsuits were something people read about, not something that happened in their peaceful community. Brenda then tried to minimize the situation, claiming it was an unfortunate incident and that the HOA had always acted in good faith. But Robert, who was also present, was not having it. He stood up, his voice clear and firm. "In good faith, Brenda," he challenged, his gaze fixed on her. "You declared a path on Mr. Miller's private property as common, you fenced it off, and then you completely neglected its maintenance. My mother, a long-standing resident, was injured because of your negligence. This isn't about good faith, it's about accountability. We have clear evidence that the HOA, after claiming ownership of that path, failed to maintain it to safe standards. My lawyer has advised me that the HOA is fully liable." He then, much to Brenda's visible horror, pulled out a copy of the very same HOA bylaw section 4.c.2 that I had used, holding it up for everyone to see. "This bylaw," Robert declared, "clearly states the HOA's responsibility for maintaining any newly established common areas, especially when they cause environmental or structural issues. Mr. Miller here," he gestured towards me, "even tried to warn you weeks ago about the very issues that led to my mother's fall, and you ignored him. You even tried to make him responsible for cleaning up the mess you created." His words were a direct hit, exposing Brenda's hypocrisy and incompetence to the entire community. The room erupted in murmurs, a mix of shock and indignation directed squarely at the HOA board. The board members looked utterly defeated. They knew they were caught. The sheer cost of a lawsuit, compounded by the undeniable evidence and their own bylaws, was a weight they couldn't ignore. After a tense, whispered consultation among themselves, Brenda, looking utterly miserable, finally cleared her throat. "All right," she announced, her voice barely a whisper, "the HOA board has decided to settle with Mrs. Davison. We will cover all her medical expenses, and provide additional compensation for her pain and suffering and lost wages." A wave of relief washed over Mrs. Davison and Robert, but it quickly turned to a renewed sense of anger in the room. This settlement would cost the HOA, and therefore every homeowner, a significant sum of money. "And," Brenda continued, her voice gaining a touch of grim resolve as she looked at me, "we will also address Mr. Miller's invoice." She couldn't bring herself to admit I was right, but the implication was clear. They were finally admitting defeat, not just to Robert, but to my silent, patient strategy. The news of the settlement and the HOA's decision to pay my invoice spread like wildfire through the community. Many residents, who had felt powerless against Brenda's rigid rule, quietly approached me, expressing their admiration for my calm perseverance. Some even offered to help me manage the future interactions with the HOA, sensing a shift in the community's power dynamics. It was a clear sign that genuine kindness and a principled stand could eventually triumph over stubbornness and overreach. I felt a sense of vindication, not just for myself, but for the principle of fairness. My ranch, meanwhile, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The creek ran clear, the new erosion barriers doing their job, and the path, while still a public thoroughfare, at least no longer threatened my land's health. However, even with the threat of a lawsuit gone, the HOA still had to deal with the immediate problem of the poorly maintained pathway. It was still a liability, and now, a very public embarrassment. Their legal counsel, whom they had finally consulted, surely advised them that ignoring the path's condition after paying out a settlement would be incredibly foolish. So, the HOA made an announcement. They would be investing in a major upgrade to the common pathway. This included proper drainage, better quality gravel, and even some decorative, low-maintenance landscaping along its edges. It was an expensive undertaking, far more than the initial shoddy graveling. They held another meeting to discuss the budget for this project, and the atmosphere was decidedly glum. Brenda, now stripped of her previous bravado, merely presented the figures, her face etched with defeat. The cost of these upgrades would necessitate a special assessment, meaning every homeowner, including Brenda and the other board members, would have to pay an extra fee on top of their regular HOA dues. The very path they had so eagerly claimed was now costing them a fortune. As the weeks turned into months, the pathway transformation began. Crews arrived, not just to fix the existing problems, but to genuinely improve the path. They laid down a new, higher quality gravel, installed proper drainage systems to prevent future runoff into my creek, and even added small, solar-powered lights along its length for safety at night. The path became truly well-maintained, smooth, and safe. Every time I saw a new load of gravel being delivered, or a crew meticulously raking the path, I knew the cost was adding up for the HOA. The payment was ongoing, tangible, and directly linked to their decision to claim my land. It wasn't me asking them for money, but their own choices forcing them to spend heavily to maintain what they had taken. It was a clever, self-sustaining consequence. Then, a new extreme event unfolded, stemming directly from the significant financial strain the HOA was now under. The special assessment for the pathway had been very unpopular. Many homeowners, already frustrated by Brenda's past actions and now facing unexpected costs, began to question the HOA's overall management. Whispers turned into open complaints. A group of concerned residents started organizing, holding informal meetings to discuss the HOA's budget, their rules, and specifically, Brenda's leadership. They created a petition, calling for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA board, and demanding a complete overhaul of the leadership. The sheer scale of the financial impact from the lawsuit and the path upgrades had finally broken the community's silence. The residents, once intimidated, now felt empowered, united by their shared financial burden and their desire for a more fair and transparent HOA. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, a battle not just over a pathway, but over the very future of the homeowners association itself. The air crackled with anticipation at the special HOA meeting called to address the petition for a vote of no confidence. It felt less like a community gathering and more like a pivotal moment in a long, quiet battle. The community center was packed, far more crowded than any previous meeting. People stood along the walls, spilling out into the hallway, all buzzing with a mixture of anger, frustration, and a newfound sense of collective power. Brenda, flanked by the remaining, visibly nervous board members, sat at the table, her usual stern demeanor replaced by a haunted, defensive look. She tried to open the meeting with her customary formalities, but a chorus of voices quickly interrupted her. This wasn't going to be her meeting, it was the community's. Robert, Mrs. Davison's son, stepped forward, holding the thick stack of signed petition papers. His voice resonated with quiet authority, cutting through the murmurs. "Brenda," he began, "we're not here for procedural delays. This community has lost faith in the current leadership. The lawsuit, the exorbitant special assessment, and the blatant disregard for homeowners' rights, specifically Mr. Miller's property, have made it clear that a change is desperately needed. We have gathered over 75% of the homeowners' signatures for a vote of no confidence. We demand a vote immediately, followed by new elections." A wave of applause and cheers erupted, emboldening everyone in the room. Brenda, cornered and clearly outmatched, tried to argue, citing obscure procedural rules, but her voice was drowned out. The collective will of the homeowners was undeniable. Faced with an open revolt, and likely advised by their now very active lawyer in the background, she finally, reluctantly, conceded. The vote was held then and there, a quick show of hands that was overwhelmingly against the current board. It was a landslide. Brenda and her allies were voted out, their reign of rigid rules and overreach brought to an abrupt and humbling end. The new elections were scheduled for the following week, promising a fresh start for the community. It was an incredibly powerful moment, showing that even the smallest acts of standing up for what's right can snowball into massive change when enough people decide to unite. With Brenda and her hardline board gone, a new spirit began to permeate the HOA. The new board, elected with a mandate for transparency and fairness, included Robert and several other reasonable, community-minded individuals. They immediately set about reviewing the HOA's budget, bylaws, and past decisions. My invoice for the creek remediation, initially dismissed as fraudulent, was among the first items they formally approved for payment, recognizing its legitimacy and Brenda's prior error. They even sent me a polite, apologetic letter, acknowledging the previous board's overreach and thanking me for my patience. The large sum of money they now owed me from that invoice, stemming from their own bylaws, became a symbol of their past mistakes. Then came the final, wild twist, born directly from the new board's thorough review of the HOA's financial records and property deeds. It turned out Brenda's relentless pursuit of common areas, and her insistence on expanding HOA control had a hidden, very expensive side. In her eagerness to claim the pathway across my ranch, she had, in fact, overstepped not just one, but two property lines. The old, dubious map she had brandished, when cross-referenced with proper, modern surveys by the new board, revealed a stunning error. A tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of land, about 5 feet wide and running for nearly 100 feet, at the very end of the newly fenced common pathway, actually belonged to Brenda herself. It was a tiny, overgrown corner of her own backyard, hidden behind a thick hedge. But because she had insisted the entire fenced-off section was a common pathway, and had funded its improvement with HOA money, the HOA had unknowingly spent a substantial amount of money upgrading and maintaining a section of pathway that was, in reality, her own private property. The new board was aghast. Not only had Brenda forced the HOA to pay me for damage on my land, but in her zeal, she had unwittingly made the HOA spend its precious funds to improve her own private property. They discovered the bills for the gravel, the drainage, the solar lights, all extending to the very end of the pathway, which ended precisely on Brenda's personal sliver of land. The total amount spent by the HOA on this portion of the common pathway that was actually Brenda's personal property was staggering, easily twice what they had originally spent just to put the fence up. They had been paying for her personal landscaping, all under the guise of common property improvements. The ultimate irony was that Brenda, who had been so obsessed with making me pay for perceived infractions and claiming my land, was now on the hook herself. The new HOA board, determined to restore fiscal responsibility and fairness, delivered Brenda a formal invoice. It wasn't just for her share of the previous special assessment. It was a demand for reimbursement for all the HOA funds spent on improving the section of common pathway that was, in fact, her own private land. They also informed her that, since the path was now officially designated common property by the community, and given her previous actions, she would now be responsible for paying a specific, ongoing maintenance fee to the HOA for the continued upkeep of the portion of the path that ran through her own yard, just as she had attempted to levy fees on others. The very system she had exploited was now being used against her, fair and square. Brenda, stripped of her power and facing a massive personal bill that she could not escape, eventually sold her house and moved away, unable to bear the public humiliation and the financial burden of her own making. The community, finally free from her rigid grip, thrived under the new, fair leadership. My ranch was still my peaceful sanctuary, and the common pathway, while still a shortcut across a corner of my land, was now a symbol of lessons learned. Lessons about fairness, accountability, and the wild, unexpected ways that kindness and a little bit of cleverness can lead to true justice.